millions of Africans were captured, torn from their families, and shipped across the ocean to lives of unimaginable hardship. The kings, chiefs, and rulers of many West African societies were not just bystanders to the trade, they actively participated in it. Slavery, a dark chapter in human history. When we speak of the transatlantic slave trade, our minds often turn to the brutal enslavement of millions of Africans by European and American traders. But today, we will confront an uncomfortable truth, one that we rarely discuss with the same fervor. The role of African kings, chiefs, and leaders in this tragedy. For centuries, the narrative of the transatlantic slave trade has often focused on the horrors inflicted by Europeans and Americans, and rightly so. Millions of Africans were captured, torn from their families, and shipped across the ocean to lives of unimaginable hardship. The abduction, abuse, and enslavement of Africans by Europeans for nearly 5 centuries dramatically altered the global landscape and created a legacy of suffering and bigotry that can still be seen today. Between 1501 and 1867, nearly 13 million African people were kidnapped, forced onto European and American ships, and trafficked across the Atlantic to be enslaved, abused, and forever separated from their homes, families, ancestors, and cultures. The transatlantic slave trade represents one of the most violent, traumatizing, and horrific eras in world history. Nearly 2 million people died during this barbaric middle passage across the ocean. The African continent was left destabilized and vulnerable to conquest and violence for centuries. The Americas became a place where race and color created a caste system defined by inequality and abuse. In the colonies that later became the United States, slavery took on uniquely appalling features. From New England to Texas, black people were dehumanized and abused while they were enslaved and denied basic freedoms. Legal and political systems were created to codify racial hierarchy and ensure white supremacy. Slavery became permanent and hereditary, defined by race-based ideologies, and insisted on racial subordination of black people for decades after the formal abolition of slavery. Millions of black people born in the US were subjected to abuse, violence, and forced labor, despite the young nation's identity as a constitutional democracy founded on the belief that all men are created equal. Racialized slavery was ignored, defended, or accommodated by leaders, while the new nation gained extraordinary wealth and influence in the global economy based on the forced labor of enslaved black people. But there's another part to this story that we must acknowledge: the role played by Africans in enslaving other Africans. The kings, chiefs, and rulers of many West African societies were not just bystanders to the trade, they actively participated in it. African rulers often waged wars against rival tribes, not just for land or resources, but to capture prisoners of war whom they could sell to European traders. For gold, guns, and goods, they traded their own people, fueling the supply of human beings for the transatlantic slave market. One of the most significant hubs of this trade was West Africa, where powerful kingdoms like the Ashanti and Dahomey kingdoms built their economies around the sale of slaves. These kings were not forced into the trade. They made calculated decisions, seeing the sale of slaves as a way to consolidate power, expand their wealth, and maintain control over their rivals. Several surveys and reports have indicated that most black nationals of American and European countries trace their ancestry to West Africa and Central Africa, where slave trade was rife, as opposed to the regions of Eastern and Southern Africa, where slave trade was not as rife as to the West and Central regions. It is important to understand that while European traders established the transatlantic system, they could not have done it without the collaboration of some African leaders. They were complicit, knowing full well the fate of those sold, torn from their homeland, and subjected to a lifetime of misery and servitude in faraway lands. We must ask ourselves, why is this truth often ignored? Why do we comfortably lay all the blame at the feet of Europeans and Americans while failing to recognize the betrayal from within our own continent? By ignoring this reality, we are complicit in rewriting history, a history that needs to be fully told. Africans were not passive victims. They were part of the mechanism that enslaved millions. And while it is true that Europeans provided the demand and the ships, African rulers provided the supply. This does not lessen the atrocities committed by Europeans and Americans. It does, however, add complexity to the narrative. Both sides bear responsibility. We need to have an honest conversation about this. Just as we hold European nations accountable for their role in the slave trade, we must also recognize the complicity of those African leaders who sold their own people. We cannot cherry-pick our history or choose only the parts that fit our preferred narrative. If we are to truly understand the legacy of slavery, we must confront every aspect of it. This is not about shifting blame or excusing anyone's actions. It's about acknowledging a shared history of betrayal, one that Africans today must reckon with if we are to heal and move forward as a united continent. The wounds of slavery still run deep in the African diaspora. For centuries, African Americans and Africans in the Caribbean and South America have had to live with the scars of this betrayal. And for Africans in the continent, the legacy of that complacency lingers in the form of broken communities, poverty, and a disconnection from our brothers and sisters across the globe. It is important that we remember not just to condemn, but to learn. If we fail to acknowledge the full scope of our history, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. Today, as we strive for unity and progress, we must remember the lessons of our ancestors' complicity in this tragedy. We must hold ourselves to account, just as we hold others accountable. The transatlantic slave trade was one of humanity's greatest tragedies. It is a history marred by exploitation, suffering, and betrayal. But by acknowledging every part of this history, both the external forces and the internal decisions, we can honor the lives lost and build a future that is informed by the mistakes of the past. Only then can true healing begin. Thank you for watching. Let's continue this conversation and never forget the lessons history has to teach us.